served as Director of HR in manufacturing, banking, and in the funeral businesses. He helps organizations in the preparation and support of EEO compliance, affirmative action plans, OFCCP audit preparedness, and HR best practices. He and his firm serve clients from coast to coast in a wide range of industries. Tim has also served in many SHRM leadership board roles, regionally and nationally, and is certified in the HR profession. He is the chair of the Arkansas Industry Liaison Group, an organization whose mission is to develop open lines of communication between employers and the OFCCP and the EEOC. Tim is recognized as a seminar leader and keynote speaker for SHRM conferences. He has received Outstanding Member Award from the Arkansas Human Resources Association and the American Society for Training and Development. He is also a recipient of the Arkansas Human Resources Professional of the Year Award. So today, Tim is going to speak with us about compensation interview, title, "Oh, I didn't mean to say that," and other salsa dance moves to try. So ladies and gentlemen, let's please welcome Tim Orellano, PHR.
Thank you, Ratin, very much for that introduction, and I want to welcome everybody today, and it's certainly a privilege to participate in today's webinar, and I know your time is very valuable, and one of the things we're going to really focus in on is the compensation interview that I can assure you is going to occur in the event of a OFCCP audit, and could occur with an EEOC investigation as well, because the DOL is definitely focused on pay equity and compensation, and it is complicated, as one of my friends, Mickey Silverman, coined the word complicated with the emphasis on comp. And there are, close to over 100 people on the webinar today, and I can assure you no two of you have the same compensation system and how you make decisions. And so it's important that we really focus in on this and help the agency understand our particular compensation system. And so I'm going to cover just a few of the initial foundational elements and the reasons for the focus on compensation and what you can expect in an interview, and more importantly, what are some of the tips and strategies that you can take going forward. Now, it's my style to take a very non-traditional way to present information, and so I use the metaphor of a salsa dance. So this is probably going to be a little non-traditional than what you normally see in a webinar, but I think we'll have a little fun with it as well. So to get started here, we want to talk about, what about this salsa dance? And I can assure you the government wants to be your dance partner, and they want to dance with you because in increased transparency in various executive orders that has occurred, that even with applicants, pay is just not a secret anymore. And actually, if you really studied the NLRB Section 7, they consider discussion of pay among employees protected concerted activity anyway, and then the OFCCP last year passed their executive order on pay transparency. So there's just lots of transparency about pay. No question about it. And then with the agencies, they have hired statisticians, economists, lawyers with a focus on pay. And there's many high-profile lawsuits that are out there. J.P. Morgan, Google, we've all seen them, and the essence of it is about pay. Also, the public awareness. There's many reports that's in the media about the pay gap. There's various surveys that we'll talk about between 88 cents to $1 disparity between women and men in jobs. But it's certainly just front and center. You see it in stockholders making demands for disclosure on published, ask for published studies on what the pay is. And so it's really gone even beyond, it's really beyond what the government is doing, because it's just out there in TV shows. I've seen it. There's lots of new rules about all of this. The executive order, the new, a couple of years ago, the new audit letter, item 19 in particular, asking for specific, highly detailed information about your compensation. There's lots of states that are putting their own legislation in regarding pay. Many states, I think it's up to 27 or so, you can't even ask for past work pay history. And certainly it is a top priority. If you look at the EEOC's strategic plan, 3 out of 5 of their strategic plan initiatives deal with pay. And certainly with OFCCP, it's in every audit, and where they're trying to even tie that into initial hiring. So that's why they want to be your dance partner. So let's talk about this salsa dance and see where we're going to dance and where we're going to go with all of this. So get your dance cards ready. The compensation interview, just like as in any dance, has music, and in this music, OFCCP has this music, and they want to see what they have the music to identify what your compensation is. They have their music in terms of their audit objectives to justify their staffing, their budgets, and their mission. In any dance, you have rhythm. And so what we're going to do is look at, well, what can we expect in an interview, a compensation interview? What's that rhythm going to be like? And then in any dance, you have steps. And so we're going to take a look at the steps on what is going to take place prior to, during, and after that interview. What are some strategic steps that you should be taking to learn this dance? And in any dance, you're following the steps. And so what we're going to do is look at what that following is all about. What's the movement? What's the process of the interview? And then in leading, there's always a leader that's going to lead the dance one way or the other. And this is the most important part, which we'll take a look at, is to take proactive actions to lead that interview and position the organization in the best way possible to explain our compensation and explain it in such a way that it's non-discriminatory. So that's the context of the compensation interview dance, the salsa dance, and so let's take a look at what that music sounds like. When you look, and as I go through this, I'm not going to cover every bullet point in the slides. You're going to be getting a copy of it. It's going to be self-explanatory, so I'll be just pointing out just certain areas that are important, and certainly am available for questions at any time. But when you add up all these various elements or components, when you add all of this up, this whole list, and you add it up, basically you're just getting an increased data request and deep dive by EEOC or OFCCP. And so these have built up over time, and it's just the reality that has caused this focus on compensation and certainly the interview. So when we look at the rhythm, as we talked about, the rhythm is what can we expect in a compliance review. Certainly here is a list of those. You can read those, but it's really going to come down to when we've submitted this detailed information and requests are made for policies, it's going to come down to, particularly in the interview, well, how are those decisions made? Because they're trying to tie the data back to the detailed information or how we're going to explain how it works. Also, we can expect what are the factors that influence pay? And we'll take a look at that in detail. But there are factors that typically influence decisions that we make about our pay, and strategically how we're going to handle these review issues and these broad data requests and the regression that the agency is going to take, that they're going to have the red flag regression analysis, and whether or not we've done a regression analysis or not, we should, but that's where we're going to go and how they're going to conduct this. Typical questions that are going to be asked are that really ties into the rhythm of this music is the detailed questions about the information that we've already submitted in item 19 of an OFCCP review. And bonuses, it goes beyond just base pay. So filling in these blanks and filling in the reasons for the detailed information are some of the questions, and we'll look at some examples of that here momentarily. It really comes down to these three elements. What OFCCP and EEOC is attempting to answer, and certainly the compliance officer or the investigator is trying to do, is one, are there measurable differences in compensation on the basis of sex, race, or ethnicity? So they're really trying to determine if there's discrimination. And these three questions is what we've got to help the agency understand in the best possible way. The challenge, I think, for us is we've got to help the compliance officer understand how we pay people and why. The compliance officers have a really, really tough job. They really do, and I sympathize with them because they have lots of audits they're working on. Many of them have never worked in human resources or compensation. So they're handling a lot of audits. They may not have that background, and they're trying to keep each one of these separate. And each one of you have different ways you handle your compensation. So certainly the compliance officer is trying to put everybody in the same shoe, and that's just not reality. So we have to do our best to help them understand our process and how we do things. But those are the three questions they're trying to answer. So what are some other rhythm in this music we can expect? Make no mistake about it that this is a free deposition discovery. And if anyone's been in litigation, you know what deposition is. And so that's what this is. Generally, it's going to be conducted by phone. They have a pre-approved script, and they basically have taken the numbers, and so some of the questions and the follow-up requests, it generally follows the same format from my experience, is just digging into tying together what they have and the analysis that they have conducted to see what, if we can explain some red flags. They're really coming down to what I call the 3 Ps. You know, we typically have our policy, whether it's our handbook or our compensation policy, and the second P is practice. Many times from my experience, the policy does not match our practice. What we say we do, and then when you really get down to it, many times is very different. But the third P is that the burden of proof is always going to be on the employer to prove it, to prove what our policy is and what our practice is. That's the challenge. And does it align with the results of the documentation of our decisions? So in a dance, we have steps. So let's take a look at some of these steps in our dance and see if we can learn the steps. If anyone remembers Fred Astaire, probably most on the call may not remember Fred Astaire, but he was a famous dancer, and he had a great quote. He said, "Do it big, do it right, and do it with style." And that's what our goal is, that we have to help OFCCP learn our dance, learn our compensation, so that we can win Dancing with the Stars. That's the goal. And this really comes down to teaching the compliance officer, whoever's investigating, to understand our pay systems and what factors. In my opinion, being how to explain it before the government asks it is really what this is all about. We really shouldn't be waiting before the shoe drops to be going down this road. We should be satisfying ourselves that our compensation decisions and how we do things are non-discriminatory, because this is, and we should be doing this proactively before we have an audit or an investigation starts, because once that starts, and we don't know what we don't know, it's like trying to get toothpaste back in the tube. It's really hard to do, and it puts us under the gun if we aren't proactive in doing this beforehand. So in learning the dance steps, we should be answering these kinds of questions to ourselves. Do we have a compensation policy? Is it even written down? And we want to know what to say and what not to say. And it's not that we're trying to hide anything here. It's really more about trying to keep it simple and keep it focused during the interview, being specific with regard to job titles and not disclosing what is not asked for. Any attorney will tell you in a deposition, you answer the question and you don't go beyond the question if it's not to your benefit. And knowing what our job-specific variables are. And the most important issue here, I believe, is conducting a practice role play of the interview prior to that, okay? So these are just some of the dance steps. In addition, you should think about, well, should we record the call? You have to check your state regulatory requirements on recording a call, whether or not you have to disclose that to the other party. Every state's a little bit different, but it's certainly something to think about, because the compliance officer is taking handwritten notes and you can't see what's being written. And so that's why it's important to control the process and know what that music is. Obviously, I think that you should have an attorney present during this process, and only answer questions, no more, no less. Keep it simple. If the question comes out and you don't really understand the question, or whoever's asking that whoever's responding, ask for clarification, paraphrase and repeat it, or just be quiet. Nothing wrong with that. So, and if you don't know what the answer might be, then just say, well, you know, I don't know. I'll just have to get back to you on that. You know, that's how you handle it.
Tim, just sorry to interrupt. We're getting some feedback saying that the sound keeps cutting in and out. I just want to make sure that everybody can listen and properly. Would anybody, is the problem still there, that sound keeps cutting in and out? For anyone in the audience, you can let me know. Okay, it's fine. All right, okay. Go ahead.
All right, thank you. Here is something that you might want to think about in terms of these dance steps is ask for the questions in advance. You're probably not going to get them, but you know, it doesn't hurt to ask. You might get them. Certainly, if you can get them in advance, that's best. After that interview is conducted, ask for those. Ask for the notes from the compliance officer. You want a copy of those notes, and if there's some answers that was recorded that really are not correct, you need to edit that and send them back. You're going to be asked to sign the statement of this but just keep in mind that you are not required to do that. There's nothing in regulation that says you have to do that, and you don't have to sign it. So just keep that in mind. Okay, what about following? Here are a few items in terms of any dance that what are the best dance moves to follow? And certainly here are some ideas about this in terms of having a proactive pay analysis. That's just something that you should be doing. And the first area up here is that really focus on job titles. The agency typically tries to roll titles and create compensation along EEO job classifications. And I don't know of anyone who handles pay that way. So you want to be sure that your jobs and your compensation is job title specific. And then here in terms of what I mean by time-based variables is typically differences in pay typically can be explained by length of service. Generally, not always, but generally pay is determined if you've been with the organization longer or time in the job. Those are kind of the first two time-based variables that in your database you really should identify what that is. Other variables might be prior experience, might be training, might be education. The problem and the challenge that we all have, I think, is that most of these additional variables outside of length of service or time in the job that are generally pretty easy, prior experience, training, education, typically are not in our HRIS or a database systems, and they're regimented to the hard copy file. That makes it very difficult. So a lot of organizations are moving to getting that information in there so that you can have a better handle on it and have better access to figure it out prior to any kind of investigative agenda from an agency or third party. Some other moves to follow has to do with can you explain differences in pay? I call it can you explain the unexplained? So some analysis should be done prior to any investigation. That's just good HR best practice. For example, if you're in banking, and I know there's some financial institutions on the call, but if you're in banking, and let's just take example lenders. Well, can we explain why all the male lenders are making more than the female lenders? Or the white lenders are making more than minority lenders, whichever way it goes. Well, so, why is that? Is it time in the job? Is it length of service? Is it prior experience? Is it training? Is it the size of the portfolio? Those are issues that we really have to look at to see if we can explain the unexplained. And if we can't through some job-related factors, then we have a little challenge on our hands on, well, why is it? And if we're all left with is race or gender, then we better go about fixing it quickly and quietly. So we have to be able to explain this because I can assure you the agency has already conducted a regression analysis, and they're trying to take that red flag and see what's really going on through our individually. So we should obviously already conduct our own regression, obviously. Here are some other dance moves, very critical, that when you get notice of this interview, I think that it's important right here in this very first area here that we should contact the compliance officer, whoever is going to be conducting an interview, and really narrow down, what's the primary focus of the investigation. Typically, sometimes they're wanting to do all jobs when really it's not all jobs. It's just a few jobs, and we want to narrow that down. And the reason we want to narrow it down, and the explanation is that we've got to identify who needs to be and the best person to answer the questions during the interview. And it may be, for some jobs, it's going to be the HR manager, it could be the comp manager, it could be other individuals. So we want to narrow this down as best we can so it's a focused interview. And then this list here is all about over-prepare the person to be interviewed. That should be done at least a couple of weeks prior to. Here is the list. You can read that, and I'm going to share with you a couple of the commonly asked questions, because we've got to keep in mind that the OFCCP already has the hard data, and now we're getting into some anecdotal question, Q&A, and information on the raw data. So we really got to review all this in advance. The person has to be prepared to respond to what's coming. When we get into the interview and some ideas regarding how to handle this, always ask for clarification if questions are unclear. Generally what happens, the questions are very broad. So I recommend that whoever's being interviewed restate that question, refocus the question, and be comfortable with saying that you don't know. In this situation, you need to have a consultant or attorney or other person there taking notes during the interview. Or if we're getting outside of what this is about, an attorney or a consultant can jump in on that call, and everyone, the compliance officer, needs to know who all's on the call to head off an area that has nothing to do with the interview focus. And you also certainly want to figure out who's going to handle and take care of notes and review notes after the fact to send back a response. Here are a few questions from my experience that's going to occur, and you'll see these when you get the handout that's going to be sent to you. But just think about this. If you had to answer these questions, for example, the very first one, explain how pay decisions are made at our company. Well, we really need to be able to answer that and write down that answer. And does it make sense? And is it aligned with what really happens? We don't want to be answering these types of questions on the day of the interview, because these are questions that are going to happen. I can assure you these are just some of them. And so if we really don't know how we're going to answer them, then we've got a problem on our hands. Here's a couple of more. You're going to be asked what factors are used to set base pay. That's a very broad-based question. And the real answer to that question is that all factors are different for different jobs. So we can explain, we had to know what those factors are for certain jobs, because certain factors for job A are going to be different than job B. This last one here, well, let me go to this one on performance ratings. This one is always a problem from my experience, because we'll say that, we have a great performance appraisal system, it's tied to pay, and then when you really get down to it, it really isn't tied to pay at all. That's always problematic. In conducting self-audits, you're going to be asked whether or not you conduct self-audits of compensation. And how we really should respond to that is that the answer is yes. If there's a follow-up question about, well, yes, there is, we did, and we found no issues, the compliance officer is probably going to say, well, they want a copy of it. And if we've done our job right, we've protected that under attorney-client privilege, and the response is going to be, well, we did that under attorney-client privilege, it's protected, we found no issues, and that's just the end of it. They're not going to get that, quite frankly. So what are some dance moves to follow in the interview? First, you want to be able to explain how you make decisions based on job-specific, job title-specific starting pay. We want to definitely avoid generalities. Never go down the road that everything is just one way, because, again, our job is to help that compliance officer understand our pay system and keep it focused on certain jobs, because generalities and compensation, from my experience, just isn't how that works. So this really comes down to leading. In any dance, you have someone who's going to lead that dance one way or the other. And so here are some ways to lead your dance, your salsa dance, to mitigate any pay equity risk. You really ought to be thinking about established starting pay ranges, because the agency is really focused on aligning the steering issues in pay, and how, particularly for females, more often it seems like that if the starting pay is just shooting from the hip because they didn't negotiate good enough, they start out behind and they never catch up. So just have some starting range for your jobs. That just keeps you out of trouble. And then if it's beyond that, have a way in which you have an upper management or another level review and document why you're starting someone the way you are. Certainly any pay decision, even going forward, should have some documentation about why the decision was made on how we pay people, because we have to prove our decisions. The burden of proof is on us. A few other items here is many times these performance appraisal systems do not tie back to pay. They're problematic most of the time, so we really have to be careful about that. And, establish a process. Review your pay grades. Really, this is all about good HR, really good HR in terms of compensation, being proactive about how you're going to be able to explain your pay processes. In any pay, particularly pay analysis, it is highly recommended that you protect that under attorney-client privilege, particularly if you cannot explain the unexplained. If you cannot explain the unexplained, then you're going to have to go about figuring out, okay, well, how are we going to correct this situation? And we want to protect that from outside parties getting their hands on that tool from which we made some changes about our pay and how we conducted some adjustments. We also want to be looking at, well, what are some trends and areas of opportunity across job titles? Because if we have conducted a proactive analysis prior to an interview, there may be some trends and areas that are affecting certain job titles more than others. This interview is going to expose this, because the agency is going to see the raw data, they're going to see the regression, and they're going to see some trends, and we have to look for those trends. They're going to ask about them, and we have to look at those trends before the agency does. So this interview process I think that the most important, other than the proactive points I'm trying to make here, is that you have to practice the interview. You have to role play. You have to be really hard on 2 weeks out at a minimum of conducting a role play of this interview in covering all of these areas and challenging whoever's making the responses to see how they're going to respond under pressure, because it's going to be pressure, and to practice the responses and practice what you know is coming on some of these questions that I've given you. So we have some time for some questions. I've come up with an acronym using SHRM, and the S is scrutinize your compensation now. And that's what it's all about. It's taking a look at your compensation now and just pretending, hey, we have an investigation, we have an interview coming up, and we're going to conduct an interview ourselves. We're going to look at our compensation. Can we explain the unexplained? We're going to do a pay analysis to be sure we're paying our people properly. Sometimes what I've found is things fall through the cracks. I call it an uh-oh. Someone got paid something and we can't explain it. We don't know why, but let's just fix it. Let's fix it quickly and quietly. The A is attach attorney-client privilege. In any particularly pay analysis, if we're seeing some areas that we're really uncomfortable about, and then any subsequent analysis, particularly a regression analysis or a pay equity analysis of certain jobs or all jobs, we want to protect that under attorney-client privilege and then go from there. I can assure you that OFCCP is going to conduct a regression analysis, and I hope that through the current administration they're going to be a little transparent about when they allege problem areas but won't disclose their analysis so that we can defend what it is. We'll see how that plays out, since there's supposed to be a move towards more of an assistance than an enforcement agenda or a gotcha program. The L of SALSA is leverage your knowledge of the interview dance. So today, I've given you the metaphor of an interview dance. Hopefully you can use this in training and how you look at it, breaking the interview dance into pieces so that you can follow it, so that it makes sense. But just, knowledge is power. The S is select how to present your compensation data. You really have to take a look at how you on the front end, particularly on item 19 of an audit, how you're going to present that data, because you're giving them the raw data. And then there's going to be subsequent detailed questions asking for additional information, and then that is creating the framework for the compensation interview because they know where they want to go with it. So you really got to understand how you're presenting that data on the front end, and then the questions you can figure out pretty quickly, what the issues are. So it's how you're going to present that puts you in the best light, and to explain things on the front end. And then the last word or the last letter of SALSA is assess interview responses in practice. Practice, practice, practice. Vince Lombardi once said that perfect practice makes perfect. So role play, practice that interview. Don't minimize that. Don't try to do it an hour before the interview. It's just not going to work. So assess your own interview responses and how you're going to do that. Does it make sense? write down the answers to the questions. Does it look right? Is it going to make sense? So practice. So with that, we'll take some questions here. Hopefully we've got a few minutes here, about 10 minutes or so. And I'm going to turn it over to Ratine here, and we'll take some questions, or hopefully this has been beneficial and a little non-traditional. So Ratine, I'll just turn it over to you.
Yeah, can I please move the slide, please? Next slide. Yeah, great. So thank you very much, Tim. Obviously, very important topic, and I love the framework, the SALSA framework of how we prepare before, scrutinize before, how we ask the questions ourselves and be prepared and use attorneys and use the data and really be ready to answer questions before they are asked. So which is great. Thank you very much for this insightful, thoughtful, and entertaining presentation. Now, before we move on to the Q&A session, and please do send any questions you have for Tim in the middle, in between. You can ask specific questions. You can also have, in any specific situation, you can send, if we cannot address it now, we can send it to Tim later on. As you know, just one small thing I wanted to talk about at JOBfindah, we do try to bring in outside speakers on several topics. In the past few months, we had topics about OFCCP recruitment audit. This one is on compensation. We had a talk on affirmative action. We had also talked about, what to expect in 2018 audits. Obviously, OFCCP is talking about more assistance, but the number of audits are not going to go down, and that's at least what the experts are telling. And compensation is one area. There is also that area of recruitment. And a lot of times, as we have seen in the past, the recruitment part is tied with compensation. But recruitment by itself, whether you are posting your jobs, you are meeting your utilization goals for veterans hiring, for minorities, for people with disabilities, they are tied. So we offer that solution, and we are not going to talk about the solution. But if you want more information, we can provide that. As you know, personally, I have been in this industry for a long time. As Tim mentioned, I started at Monster.com, built one of their businesses. Then I built one of our competitors. I actually built American Job Exchange. I was the president for 8 years. But then we wanted to build something which I think is much better. But anyway, we can discuss that another time. So do let me know if you have any questions on those recruitment areas as well. We can help. Now, going back to the presentation, you are ready to go for the Q&A. Please do send me more questions. So far, I got a question about, Tim, if you can move to the next slide. Let me throw the question. I have one question about from John Blair. She mentioned, I know you mentioned about how the pay is fixed, especially starting pay, or what are the factors? And one of the key factors you talked about is time in job. Now, does that time include prior experience or only the experience in the company?
Well, if I understand the question, I think the question had to do with starting pay factors or just generally.
It's a general pay question. It's a factor,
okay.
Because I think. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Most of the time, depending on the job, but generally, the longer that someone has been in the job, you see a tendency that is going to explain reasons for differences in pay, let's say between one male and one female. If the male's been there 10 years as opposed to the female that's been there, say, 3 years. The other factor regarding time has to do with time in the job. I may have been with the company 10 years, but maybe I've only been in this job 1 year, as opposed to somebody who's been in the job, say, 5 years. So they may be making more because they've been in the job longer, as opposed to someone's been with the company longer. So it's good. Those are two factors that would explain some differences in pay. Those are generally pretty solid to look at. It won't always explain it, but it's a place to start. And that was my point. It's a place to start, and then you get into, well, if that doesn't explain it, is it prior experience? Is it training? Is it education? Is it certifications? You know, what is it that caused us to make decisions about why we're paying one person differently than another person, but particularly if we're finding something systemic, that it's all the males are making more, all the females, or, you know, that's kind of where we got to deal with. And let me just make one quick observation in regard to these audits, and then we go to the next question. And that is, many years ago, it was pushing maybe 4,000 audits a year. Well, now the number of audits are really more in the 1,200 range. The difference between those two numbers is the new, the audit letter and the focus on compensation. So it's really more smaller number of audits, but scrutiny, really digging into the weeds in every individual audit, some of which are averaging close to 2 years to close. So,
okay. Great. We have quite a few other questions as well, so let's go into that. One question here is, does attorney-client privilege on a compensation analysis hold up? Because apparently this is a requirement that the government, states, federal contractors must conduct.
Well, attorney-client privilege does hold up, particularly if you're using outside counsel as opposed to inside counsel. I get, it's kind of, there's a little joke out there. Well, is it outhouse counsel or in-house counsel? But certainly the attorney-client privilege is going to be more solid if you're using an outside counsel as opposed to your internal counsel. So that's the first thing. You were in your right to, I think OFCCP, tries to break that, but certainly you are supposed to, and you are required to conduct some analysis. The agency and the regulator doesn't say how you do it. So certainly they want to see, well, what give us what you did do. Well, certainly you can give them some preliminary broad analysis because you're supposed to do that, but any detail analysis, I would, particularly regression, I would have that under attorney-client privilege, and I don't think the agency overall has been able to break that because that just goes down to the rule of law, and that's just, as long as the company has followed all the rules, there's a certain pretty strict protocol, I think is the important part of this question, protocol that the attorney is going to say, it's kind of the chain of handoff in the communication. You better follow that strict protocol on the attorney-client privilege for that to work.
Okay, great. We have another question here from Ricky Cox. Says external candidates typically have more opportunity to negotiate wages and come in at much higher pay than current incumbents. Now, is this an approval reason for pay differences or approved reason for pay differences?
Well, that's the age-old compensation dilemma of, they call it compression. And someone may be in this job and they're making this, and then 5 years later conditions change, and to get that candidate you're paying more, and they're closer to the person that's been there, say, 5 years, and that's called pay compression. That's not discrimination, and certainly candidates can negotiate what they want to be paid. I think that the challenge there is that, and that's why I go back to it's in everyone's best interest to have some starting pay guidelines by job of it's not going to be, it's the minimum of this and it's going to be this, and that's the negotiable range based on that particular individual's prior experience or education, what have you. But then if the person wants more and you really want them, then it needs to go to another level to make that exception, but then you're documenting it based on some criteria so that you can prove your reason. With regard to the incumbent employees, that's if you're adjusting pay according to conditions and inflation and all that, people are going to move. But pay compression is, always an issue. It doesn't mean it's discrimination, though.
Okay.
So.
Okay. Yeah, we have some more questions. Thank you. One more is there a good resource for comp analysis training? Maybe we can, if I can get it from you, Tim, we can give in the follow-up email.
Yes, I know of a particular one. I'll be glad to give that to you, and
Great.
You can hand that to that
Right.
person.
Yeah,
Sure.
Right. There are a couple of other questions about we would post the presentation as well as the audio in the link in the follow-up. It will be posted. A lot of people have asked me about SHRM credits or HRCI. I'm actually really sorry to say for this particular one, and then that's why we did not talk about it before. We just did not get the time to arrange the credit for this particular one, but for the next one we'll have again. So I'm sorry if you did not get that credit, but hopefully Tim made it very useful for you, and I would send the presentation and the recording for you. Once again, thank you for joining, for attending this webinar. Stay tuned for our next webinar. It's going to be end of March, early April. We have a phenomenal presenter lined up and a great topic. So see you soon. Thank you. This concludes our webinar today.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.